I found it in a basement in Brussels. It wasn't a gold coin or a royal seal. It was a copper plate, etched with a map of a city that technically never existed, or rather, a city that exists in our geography but bears a name that has been scrubbed from every textbook printed after 1850. The lines were too precise for the era. The load distribution indicated by the architectural sketches suggested a mastery of physics that contradicts the primitive steam and coal narrative we've been fed. I looked at the date, 1847. According to the official record, this region was a barren wasteland of nomadic tribes and unmapped tundra. Yet, here was a grid system. Here was an infrastructure of spires and star-shaped bastions that mirrored the ruins I would later find in the American Midwest, in the heart of Paris, and beneath the sands of the Gobi. Ask yourself why a map would be hidden behind a false wall in a decommissioned library. Ask yourself why the ink feels heavier than it should. It wasn't a mistake. It was a preservation, not a fluke, not a fantasy. A record of a global silence. The silence has a frequency. If you look at the seismographic records from the mid-19th century, there is a period of 3 months where the data becomes erratic, then flatlines. They tell us it was a period of solar minimum. They tell us it was a shift in instrumentation. They are lying. I've stood in the empty shells of the grand exhibitions of the 1880s, those temporary plaster cities that were supposedly built in months and burned down in days. I've touched the stone beneath the plaster. It isn't plaster, it is ancient, weathered granite. The narrative says these were celebrations of progress. The evidence suggests they were salvage operations. What if the world's fairs weren't showcases for the future, but the systematic rebranding of a fallen past? We are told that our ancestors moved through the mud with horse and carriage, yet they inherited cathedrals with vaulted ceilings designed for acoustic resonance that no modern architect can replicate without a supercomputer. We see the spires. We see the clocks that have no hands. We see the atmospheric energy collectors renamed as ornamental finials. They didn't build them, they found them, and then they erased the owners. Consider the mud. It is the great equalizer of the historical record. In every major city on this planet, from London to Moscow, from San Francisco to Tokyo, the first floor of every pre-1900 building is buried. Not by design, not by gradual subsidence. The windows are half submerged in the earth, peering out at the pavement like drowning eyes. The official explanation is light wells. They want you to believe that in an age of manual labour and expensive excavation, every architect on earth decided to dig deep into the ground just to let a sliver of light into a basement. It is a mathematical absurdity. It is an institutional gaslight. Look at the brickwork. The quality of the subterranean layers often exceeds the quality of the visible floors. This is the signature of a cataclysm that has been edited out of the collective memory. A sudden vertical displacement of soil, a liquefaction of the landscape, an atmospheric event that turned the sky into a pressurized kiln and the ground into a rising tide of silt, not a flood of water, a flood of earth. The maps are where the betrayal is most visible. Before the Great Erasure, there was Tartaria. It wasn't a tribe, it wasn't a localized kingdom, it was a sprawling, interconnected power that occupied the maps of Mercator and Hondius. It spanned from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific. It possessed a flag, a crest, and a sophisticated system of governance. Then, suddenly, the maps changed. The vast territory of Tartary was carved into independent states or labelled as unexplored territory. How does an empire that spans a continent simply vanish? It doesn't. It is liquidated. The institutional gatekeepers will tell you it was a geographical misunderstanding. They will tell you that Tartary was just a vague term for the Orient, but you don't build star forts across a vague term. You don't establish a global architectural language, the so-called Beaux-Arts or neoclassical style, unless there is a global administrative body enforcing the standard. The uniformity of the world's old world architecture is the ghost of Tartaria. It is a fossilized internet of stone and iron. I followed the trail to the archives of the Smithsonian and the British Museum, places where history goes to be categorized and, if necessary, buried. I found references to the Great Year of Ash. It's a term that appears in private diaries of the 1840s, but never in the newspapers of the time. The accounts describe a sky that turned the colour of bruised plums. They describe a heat that didn't burn wood, but melted stone. Look at the scorched sections of the Great Wall, or the vitrified forts of Scotland. We are told these are the results of ancient warfare, or primitive kilns. Not this, not that, something else. The energy required to vitrify stone is immense. It requires a focused atmospheric discharge. What if the event wasn't a natural disaster, but a weaponized reset? The mid-1800s saw a suspicious amount of great fires in every major city. Chicago, Boston, Moscow, London, all of them rebuilt with the same sterile, controlled aesthetic. The fires weren't accidents. They were the cleanup crew. They were the thermal erasers used to remove the last vestiges of the old world's free energy technology. What happened to the people? This is the part that keeps me awake in the humid silence of my study. If a global civilization was reset, where are the bodies? The answer lies in the orphan trains. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 250,000 children were shipped across the United States from the East Coast to the West. Similar movements occurred in Australia and Canada. We are told these were the children of poor immigrants, victims of the industrial slums. But look at the photographs. These children are dressed in rags, yet they carry a look of profound, shell-shocked displacement. They were being used to repopulate the empty cities, the foundlings, the waifs. They were the blank slates upon which a new, false history could be written. They were told their parents were dead, their heritage was gone, and their duty was to the new industrial machine. They were the resettlers of a world they didn't build. The empty asylums and hospitals that sprouted up in the late 1800s weren't for the sick. They were for the survivors who remembered too much. There is a specific type of tower found on every continent. They call them minarets, bell towers, or obelisks. Strip away the religious labels and look at the engineering. They are always topped with high conductivity metals. They are often situated over underground water sources or ley lines. In the old photographs, before the renovations, many of these towers had intricate wire mesh and mercury-filled bulbs. This wasn't for decoration. This was wireless power. The red grid. The Tartarian energy system utilized the ionosphere to provide light and heat to every corner of the globe. This is why the old world had no power lines. This is why the streets were illuminated by eternal lamps that required no fuel. When the event happened, the grid was sabotaged, the copper was stripped, the mercury was drained, The bells were recast as cannons. They turned a civilization of harmony into a civilization of scarcity. They forced us to pay for the very energy that the earth provides for free. Ask yourself, who benefits from the meter on your house? The erasure is not just historical, it is biological. Our very perception of time has been manipulated. The phantom time hypothesis suggests that hundreds of years were added to our calendar to distance us from the era of the Great Reset. We are told the Middle Ages lasted a millennium, yet the technology of the year 1000 and the year 1400 looks suspiciously identical. It is a filler, a temporal buffer zone. By stretching the timeline, the architects of the lie made the ruins of Tartaria look like the ancient remnants of Rome or Greece. They gave us classical history to hide the recent history. The statues we see in our parks, the ones with the laurel wreaths and the togas, look at the faces. They aren't idealized myths. They are portraits of the people who were here just 200 years ago. The stone is too crisp. The tool marks are too precise. They didn't have power drills, we are told, and yet the granite is cut with the ease of a laser through butter. I walked through the abandoned subways of New York and the catacombs of Odessa. These are not just tunnels, they are the arteries of a buried infrastructure. In some sections, the brickwork changes. It becomes smoother, harder, glowing with a faint phosphorescence when exposed to certain frequencies of light. This is the tech they couldn't fully destroy. It's buried beneath the modern world like a suppressed memory. The institutional erasure is so thorough that even the scientists are unaware of what they are looking at. They call it anomaly or out-of-place artifact. They categorize it and move it to the basement. But the patterns remain. The star forts are the keys. They are not defensive structures. If you look at them from above, they are circuit boards. They are resonators. They were designed to manage the frequency of the earth itself, to prevent the very liquefaction that eventually buried them. They failed, or they were overwhelmed. So we find ourselves in the silence. We live in the husks of a giant's house, wondering why the ceilings are so high and the doors are so grand. We accept the explanation that it was all vanity or tradition. We ignore the mud in the windows and the maps in the basement it sent, but the feeling persists. That low-level hum of knowing that we are a colonized people, living on the ruins of our own forgotten brilliance. The day Tartaria went silent wasn't just a date on a hidden calendar. It was the moment the human story was severed. We are the orphans of a golden age, wandering through a museum we've been told is a home. What if the reset happens in cycles? What if the event is scheduled? Ask yourself what they are building now that they will tell our descendants was always there. The evidence is beneath your feet. The truth is in the dirt, but the record is empty, and the silence is deafening. The transition from the old world to the new was not a transition of progress, but a transition of force. If you examine the patent records of the late 19th century, you will find a peculiar clustering of inventions that seem to rediscover principles that were already integrated into the architecture of the previous era. We are told Thomas Edison birthed the electric age in a laboratory, yet the street lights of 1850s Paris functioned on a system of atmospheric ionization that left no carbon footprint and required no billing cycle. Not a discovery, not a breakthrough, a controlled release. The new elite didn't invent the future, they metered the past. They took the wireless resonance of the Tartarian spires and tethered it to copper wires and coal-fired plants. They moved the world from the ethereal to the combustible. Ask yourself why the most efficient energy designs are always the ones that are lost in warehouse fires or suppressed by national security patents. It is the institutional gatekeeping of our very survival. The Great Reset of the 1840s required a total liquidation of the existing social contract. This is why the period is marked by an inexplicable surge in global warfare and revolutions. From the 1848 uprisings in Europe to the Taiping Rebellion in China, the world was set ablaze. We are taught these were localized struggles for democracy. What if they were the final resistance of a global confederation against the encroaching parasite of the modern central bank? The weaponry used in these conflicts defies the narrative of the musketeer. We see photographs of cities like Sevastopol or Richmond looking as though they were hit by tactical yields, stone vaporized, iron melted into slag, yet the wooden fences nearby remain untouched. This is the signature of frequency-based weaponry. The same energy that once powered the world was inverted to dismantle its centers of resistance. They didn't just win the war, they deleted the opponent from the history books. The erasure trope is most evident in the way we treat the Wild West. We are told of rugged pioneers moving into a virgin wilderness, building log cabins and fighting for survival. Yet, when they arrived in places like Salt Lake City or San Francisco, they found massive, finished stone structures that would take decades to build today. The narrative claims these pioneers built the Mormon Temple or the Palace of Fine Arts with hand tools and ox carts in a matter of years. It is a logistical impossibility. These cities were already there. They were the depopulated hubs of the Tartarian network, cleaned of their original inhabitants and discovered by the new settlers. The pioneers weren't builders. They were squatters in a palace they couldn't comprehend. They lived in the ruins and called it a new world. The Old West was actually the late Tartarian frontier, and the lawlessness we see in fiction was the chaotic fallout of a civilization's collapse. Consider the Columbian Exposition of 1893. They called it the White City. It was a sprawling marvel of neoclassical domes, lagoons, and electric light, supposedly built on a swamp in Chicago in less than 2 years. The official story says it was made of staff, a temporary mixture of plaster and hemp fibre. Then, after the fair, it conveniently burned to the ground. Why build a temporary city of such immense scale and beauty? You wouldn't. You wouldn't waste the resources. You would only do it if the city was already there, a relic of the pre-mud flood era, and you needed a cover story to explain its existence before you demolished it. The World's Fairs were the final liquidation sales of the Tartarian infrastructure. They brought the public in to marvel at the achievements of the New Age, using the technology of the Old Age as a backdrop, and then they wiped the slate clean with fire. The pattern of the Star Fort, or the Trace Italien, is the most damning piece of evidence left on the surface of our planet. There are thousands of them. They are found in the Americas, Africa, Asia, and Europe. They all follow the same sophisticated mathematical fractals. The mainstream historians tell us they were designed to deflect cannon fire. But look at the cross-sections. Many of them are built in depressions where they have no tactical vantage point. Some are built in areas where no cannon would ever reach. And most importantly, they are almost always integrated with water. They are machines. They are massive, land-based resonators designed to harmonize the vibration of the Earth's crust with the atmosphere. They were the stabilizers of the old world's climate and the hubs of its power grid. When the event occurred, the frequency was jammed, the stabilizers became anchors, and the earth rose up to swallow them. Who are the architects of this erasure? Follow the bloodlines, follow the foundations. You will find a small group of families and institutions that emerged from the mid-19th century with unprecedented wealth and a singular obsession, the classification of knowledge. They funded the universities, they wrote the curricula, they established the standard model of history and physics. They are the ones who turned the study of the past into a minefield of conspiracy labels for anyone who asks the wrong questions. They replaced the organic, localized wisdom of the Tartarian age with a centralized, top-down indoctrination. They taught us to fear the dark, to fear the primitive past, and to worship the progress that they sold to us at a premium. They are the jailers of the human timeline, and they have been very, very busy. The institutional gatekeeping extends even to our biology. The humans of the Tartarian era were taller, lived longer, and possessed a greater cranial capacity. This isn't myth. It is the evidence of the giant skeletons found in mounds across North America and the Caucasus, skeletons that are consistently lost or misplaced by the Smithsonian as soon as that they are documented. We are the diminished version of ourselves. The atmospheric pressure changed during the event. The oxygen levels dropped. The frequency of the planet was lowered. We are living in a low energy state, designed to be more manageable, more docile, and more dependent on the systems of the new elite. We look at the great cathedrals and feel a sense of awe. That awe is a biological memory of a time when our bodies were tuned to a higher resonance. In the year 1845, the British explorer Sir John Franklin vanished while searching for the Northwest Passage. It is a story of tragedy and cannibalism that every schoolchild knows. But what if Franklin wasn't looking for a trade route? What if he was part of the final reconnaissance mission to map the collapsing borders of the Tartarian North? The Arctic was not always ice. The maps from just a century prior show a green, habitable land at the pole, a Mount Meru, or a central magnetic hub. The sudden freezing of the North was a result of the same atmospheric event that buried the cities in mud. Franklin didn't get lost. He witnessed the end of the world. He witnessed the turning of the poles. And like so many others who saw the truth of the transition, he was never allowed to return. The language we speak is a tool of the erasure. Words like monument, museum, and history have been repurposed to keep us from seeing the reality. A monument is not a memorial, it is a remnant. A museum is not a gallery, it is a morgue for the technology of the predecessors. History is not a record, it is a story agreed upon by the victors. Even the word Tartaria has been turned into a ghost, a land of darkness in the Latin root. They want us to believe that anything before the 1850s was a dark age of ignorance. Yet we cannot recreate their glass, we cannot match their stone cutting, and we cannot explain how they moved blocks of granite weighing 800 tons. We are the amnesiacs of the 21st century, proud of our pocket-sized screens while we live among the ruins of a global power grid. What happens when the mud starts to settle? We are seeing it now. The digital age, for all its flaws, has allowed the orphans to talk to one another. The patterns are being recognized. The maps are being shared. The buried windows are being photographed. The institutional gatekeepers are losing their grip on the narrative. But ask yourself, if they reset the world once to hide the truth, what will they do when the truth becomes unavoidable? The unresolved philosophical open loop remains. We are a species. with a suppressed past and a manufactured future. If we don't know who built the walls around us, how can we ever hope to find the door? The silence of Tartaria is not just a mystery of the past. It is a warning for the future. We are standing on the surface of a deep, dark sea, and the tide is starting to go out. The photographs of the American Civil War and the Crimean War contain a technical impossibility. In the mid-1860s, the exposure times for cameras required subjects to stand still for several seconds, yet we see images of absolute carnage where the rubble of massive stone fortresses is pulverized into fine powder, not chunks. This isn't the work of black powder and iron balls. This is high-energy masonry disruption. If you look closely at the backgrounds of these battlefields, you will see the same buried windows, the same half-submerged arches that predate the conflict. The wars were not about ideology or territory. They were demolition projects. They were the scorched earth phase of the transition. The soldiers were not just fighting each other. They were being used as labourers to clear the old world debris and make way for the new municipal grids. Not a war, not a revolution, a renovation through blood. Ask yourself why so many historic buildings from this era are missing their blueprints. They don't exist because the victors didn't build them. They only claimed the ruins. There is a concept in engineering known as load distribution, the way a structure manages its own weight. If you study the Great Pyramids of the Giza Plateau alongside the post offices built in Washington, D.C. or Melbourne in the 1870s, the mathematical signature is identical. They utilize a specific ratio of piezoelectric quartz in the granite to generate a static charge. This is the lost science of Tartaria. It was a civilization that didn't view architecture and energy as separate fields. The building was the battery, the dome was the antenna, the city was the circuit. When the institutional gatekeepers took over, they couldn't replicate the technology, so they retrofitted it. They ripped out the mercury cores, which they now tell us are toxic, to keep us away from them, and replaced them with steam pipes. They turned the massive airy halls of the global grid into cramped dark offices for the new bureaucracy. We are literal parasites living in the hollowed out organs of a much greater biological machine. What if the Great Flood wasn't a singular event in the distant biblical past, but a series of localized, intentional atmospheric collapses? The 19th century is littered with great floods that are blamed on heavy rain or broken dams. In 1862, the entire Central Valley of California was turned into an inland sea for weeks. There was no infrastructure to blame then. The official record calls it a 1,000-year rain. But the eyewitness accounts speak of the sky breaking, of the air becoming thick with a silt-like dust before the water even arrived. This is the liquefaction process. If you vibrate the earth at a specific frequency, the ground loses its structural integrity and behaves like a liquid. The star forts were designed to prevent this by grounding the atmospheric charge. When the forts were deactivated or sabotaged, the ground gave way. The mud flood wasn't just rain, it was the earth itself rising up to swallow the evidence of the previous tenants. The most guarded secret of the modern era is the nature of the Grand Canyon. We are told it is a product of millions of years of erosion by a single river. Yet, any honest geologist will tell you the math doesn't add up. There are no massive deltas at the end of the Colorado River that would account for that much displaced earth. Look at the names of the peaks, the Temple of Isis, the Tower of Set, the Cheops Pyramid. They tell us these are just whimsical names given by early explorers. They are not. They are the identified ruins of a massive Tartarian mining and residential complex. The canyon is not a natural wonder, it is a decommissioned open-pit mine of a scale we cannot fathom. The native peoples of the area speak of great underground cities and a people who could fly. The Smithsonian immediately cordoned off these areas in the early 1900s, citing safety. They aren't protecting us from the caves, they are protecting the timeline from the evidence of a global industrial empire that operated before the reset. The erasure trope is most potent in our schools. Why are we forced to memorize dates of battles but never the history of the foundling hospitals? In the late 1800s, these institutions were overflowing with children who had no lineage. They were the primary source of labour for the new factories. They were the reset generation. They were taught a simplified language, a simplified history, and a religion that emphasized suffering and obedience. The complex, harmonic spirituality of the Tartarian age, which recognized the divinity of the human frequency, was replaced by a top-down, punitive theology. They took our connection to the earth and the ionosphere and gave us a God that required a middleman. Not this, not that, something else. A system of control that relies on us believing we are small, insignificant, and recent. But the stone in the cathedrals remembers. The frequency is still there, vibrating in the background of our consciousness, waiting to be tuned in. In the year 1888, a man named Nikola Tesla began filing patents that looked suspiciously like the technology of the Tartarian ruins. Tesla didn't invent the future. He was a translator. He was one of the few who found the scattered fragments of the old world science and tried to give it back to the people. He spoke of free energy from the air, of world telegraphy without wires, and of healing frequencies. He was the threat that the new elite couldn't ignore. They funded him, then they stripped him, then they burned his laboratories and erased his name from the textbooks for half a century. They replaced his resonance-based physics with the standard model of Einstein, a model that conveniently makes free energy mathematically impossible. Ask yourself why the laws of physics changed right as the world was being electrified. They didn't discover new laws. They built a new prison. Look at the great walls of the world, not just the one in China, but the thousands of miles of stone walls in New England, the massive dikes in the Netherlands, and the earthworks of the Mississippi Valley. We are told they are farm boundaries or flood defences. If you map them, they form a global grid. They are not walls, they are conductors. They were part of a planetary irrigation and energy system that turned the entire Earth into a garden. The Tartarians didn't fight nature, they harmonized with it. The modern desert is a man-made phenomenon, a result of the destruction of this grid. Northern Africa was once a lush forest, as shown on maps from the 1600s. The Sahara is not ancient, it is a scar. It is the site of a massive thermal event that occurred during the Great Reset. The sand is the ash of a cremated civilization. The census records of the mid-19th century are a mess of contradictions. In every major city, there is a period where the population supposedly tripled in a single decade through immigration. Where did these millions of people come from? The logistics of moving that many humans across oceans in wooden ships is a fantasy. They didn't come from across the sea. They were already here. They were the survivors of the event, gathered into the cities, processed through the asylums, and rebranded as immigrants. It is the ultimate gaslight. They told the survivors they were the newcomers, so they wouldn't realize they were the rightful owners. They gave them names, assigned them homelands, and told them to get to work. The American dream was the consolation prize for a stolen planet. We are told the Renaissance was a rebirth of Greek and Roman knowledge. It was actually the first attempt to catalogue the ruins after an earlier, smaller reset. The Black Death of the 1300s was likely a previous atmospheric event, a precursor to the 1840s collapse. History is not a line, it is a spiral of resets, each one more thorough than the last. Each time, the elite find the technology of the predecessors and claim it as their own discovery. They are the finders-keepers of our reality. They live in the penthouses of the star forts and watch us struggle in the mud. They know the cycle. They know that when the atmospheric charge builds up again, the reset will trigger. They are preparing their bunkers now, while they tell us to worry about carbon footprints. The irony is absolute. The very energy they suppressed is what is now returning to destabilize their fragile, wired world. I am writing this because the silence is ending. The mud is drying and the foundations are becoming visible. You can see it in the way the children are born now, with an intuitive grasp of technology and a deep skepticism of the official story. You can see it in the cracks of the institutional gatekeeping. They can't hide the maps anymore. They can't hide the buried windows. The unresolved philosophical open loop is this. If we are the product of a reset, if our history is a lie, then what are we? We are not the pinnacle of progress. We are the seeds in the winter, waiting for the sun. The day Tartaria went silent was the beginning of our sleep, but the earth is waking up, and when it does, the towers will hum again. Ask yourself, will you be ready to hear the sound, or will you keep your eyes on the ground, searching for the truth in the dirt? The architectural consistency of the mid-19th century suggests a singular global administrative authority that the history books refuse to name. From the state houses of the American Midwest to the administrative palaces of Rajasthan, we see the same pediments, the same fluted columns, and the same massive vaulted ceilings. They tell us this was a classical revival, a sentimental fashion choice by architects who all simultaneously decided to mimic a dead Roman aesthetic. Ask yourself, in an age of slow-moving ships and no telegraph, how did every builder on every continent settle on the exact same load, distribution, and acoustic mathematics? It wasn't a fashion, it was a standard, it was the uniform code of Tartaria. These buildings were not theatres or post offices, they were nodes. They were designed to interact with the atmospheric electricity harvested by the spires. When the new regime took over, they couldn't dismantle the stone, so they repurposed it. They turned the energy hubs into banks. They turned the healing centres into prisons. They took a world of resonance and turned it into a world of regulation. Not an influence, not a style, a takeover of existing hardware. If you walk through the streets of any old city, look at the ironwork, the fences, the gates, the ornate railings that surround the oldest parks. We are told this is Victorian ornament, but look closer at the tips of the railings. Many of them are shaped like tuning forks or small antennae. In the 19th century, these iron perimeters were often connected to the foundations of the stone buildings. They weren't there to keep people out. They were part of a grounding circuit. This is why the Industrial Revolution was so obsessed with iron. It wasn't just for bridges and rails, it was for the final modification of the atmospheric grid. By connecting the stone to the iron and the iron to the ground, the new engineers could bleed off the static charge that the Tartarians used for power. They effectively short-circuited a planet. The great smog of London and the black soot of the industrial age were the results of switching from clean, resonant energy to the combustion of filth. They forced us into a carbon-based existence to ensure we would always be paying for the fuel. The institutional erasure of our technical past is most evident in the grand organ. Every great cathedral and town hall of the old world possesses a massive pipe organ. We are told these are the musical instruments for the glory of a deity, but these organs are capable of producing infrasound, frequencies below the range of human hearing that can affect the physical state of matter. They were not built for hymns. They were acoustic stabilizers. By playing specific frequencies, the operators could maintain the structural integrity of the stone and the health of the surrounding population. This is the music of the spheres made literal. After the reset, the knowledge of frequency-based healing was suppressed. The organs were restricted to sacred music, and the science of vibration was labelled as occultism or pseudoscience. They left the machines in the buildings, but took away the manual. Now we listen to the echo of a technology that once held the very molecules of our cities in perfect alignment, never realizing that the church was actually a power station for the human soul. Consider the great lighthouse of Alexandria or the Colossus of Rhodes. We are taught these were the 7 wonders of the ancient world, long since destroyed, but the descriptions of these structures, mirrors that could burn ships, lights that could be seen for 100 miles, match the descriptions of Tartarian atmospheric energy collectors. The reset didn't just happen in the 1840s, it was the final blow in a series of corrections. Each time a civilization reaches the point of mastering the ether, a reset is triggered. The Library of Alexandria wasn't burned by a mob, it was a data purge. The books were replaced with the classics, heavily edited versions of reality that omit the technical specifications of the world. What if our history is actually a collection of fairy tales designed to keep us from looking at the ruins with an engineer's eye? What if the gods of the Greeks were simply the last administrators of the previous grid? The erasure is so deep that we can't even see the artifacts when they are standing right in front of us. The event of the mid-1800s left behind a specific biological marker, the decline of human stature. If you look at the suits of armour in the royal armouries or the doorways of the oldest cathedrals, the proportions are for a larger, more robust human. Mainstream science tells us that humans are getting taller due to better nutrition. It is a lie. They are comparing us to the malnourished reset generation of the industrial slums. If you go back further, before the year of Ash, the skeletons found in the mounds are consistently 7 to 9 feet tall. These were the Tartarians. They lived in an environment with higher oxygen pressure and a harmonious electromagnetic field. When the grid was destroyed and the atmosphere was thinned, our biology collapsed. We are the stunted survivors, living in a pressurized tank of low-frequency noise and chemical pollutants. We are small because the world was made small to fit the new master's control. Not a growth, not an evolution, a systematic downsizing of the human potential. The great exhibitions were also used to introduce the concept of nationalism. Before the reset, Tartaria was a global confederation, a borderless network of resonance and trade. To prevent this from ever rising again, the victors carved the map into nations. They gave each group a different flag, a different official history, and a different set of grievances. They turned the global language of the old world into a confusing babble of dialects. They created borders where there were once only energy lines. The wars of the late 19th century were necessary to solidify these new identities. You cannot have a global reset if the people still think of themselves as one. You must make them fear their neighbours. You must make them proud of their heritage, even if that heritage was invented in a boardroom in 1860. The World's Fairs were the first time the public was taught to see themselves as British or French or American, rather than as children of the earth. Look at the canal systems of North America and Europe. We are told they were dug by men with shovels and buckets in the early 1800s. The Erie Canal, for example, is 363 miles long. It was supposedly built in 8 years by unskilled labourers. This is a mathematical insult. These canals are perfectly levelled, stone-lined, and integrated into the natural water tables with a precision that modern GPS-guided equipment struggles to match. They weren't dug in the 1820s. They were the ancient cooling and transport veins of the Tartarian grid. The builders of the 19th century merely cleared the silt from the previous event and claimed the work. They opened the canals. They didn't build them. Ask yourself why the most important canals, like the Suez or the Panama, are situated exactly on the major intersections of the old world's ley lines. They are using the Earth's own plumbing and telling us they invented the pipe. The year without a summer in 1816 is often cited as a result of a volcanic eruption in Indonesia, but the effects were global and lasted for a decade. This was the opening salvo of the Great Reset. The volcano was a cover story for a massive atmospheric discharge that altered the climate of the entire northern hemisphere. It was the beginning of the cooling that would eventually lead to the mud floods and the liquefaction of the 1840s. During this time, the elite moved underground or to sanctuaries in the high mountains, places like Tibet or the Andes, while the population on the plains was decimated. This is why we find abandoned underground cities like Derinkuyu. They weren't for protection from raiders, they were atmospheric bunkers. When the elite returned to the surface, they found a world covered in mud and a population that had lost its mind. They stepped into the vacuum and called themselves royalty. There is a specific type of tree that is missing from our forests. If you look at the stumps that we call mountains, Devil's Tower in Wyoming, or the flat-topped mesas of the American West, the cellular structure of the rock is identical to that of a petrified tree. We are told these are volcanic plugs, but volcanoes do not produce hexagonal columns of basalt that mimic the fibrous structure of a plant. These were the world trees. The Tartarian civilization lived in the shade of Aes, biological canopy that reached into the stratosphere. These trees were the primary collectors of atmospheric energy. They were cut down. The Great Reset was not just a human event, it was a planetary logging operation. They removed the original lungs of the world to make us dependent on their artificial systems. The forests we see today are merely the scrub brush that grew back after the massacre, not a landscape, not a vista, a graveyard of giants. We are standing at the end of a cycle. The day Tartaria went silent was the moment the music stopped, but the resonance is building again. The smart cities they are building now are a desperate attempt to recreate the Tartarian grid, but without the freedom. They want the power without the soul. They are installing the 5G towers on the same spots where the spires once stood. They are using the same geometry, but for surveillance instead of harmony. The unresolved philosophical open loop is whether we will let them do it again. Will we accept the next event as a natural disaster, or will we see it for what it is? A tactical reset to keep the orphans in their place. The truth isn't hidden in a vault. It's hidden in the way the sunlight hits the basement windows of your own street. Ask yourself what else they are hiding in plain sight. The Great Fire of London in 1666, the Great Fire of Chicago in 1871, and the Great Fire of Boston in 1872 all share a common, unsettling characteristic: the melting of stone. According to official historical narratives, these were accidental conflagrations fueled by wood and wind. Yet, in the archival photographs and eyewitness testimonies, we find reports of granite blocks flowing like wax and iron railings vaporizing into thin air. Wood fires do not reach the temperatures required to liquefy stone. Not this, not that, something else. These were thermal purges. In Chicago, the fire selectively targeted the most grand and ancient-looking stone structures, leaving the flimsy wooden shacks nearby completely untouched. It was a targeted deletion of the Tartarian blueprint. The O'Leary's cow story was a nursery rhyme used to mask the deployment of directed energy. They burned the evidence of the old world's craftsmanship to replace it with the standardized, manageable boxes of the industrial age. Ask yourself why the most beautiful cities on earth always seem to have a great fire just before their history is rewritten. The concept of Roman cement is another pillar of the institutional gatekeeping of our past. We are told that the ancients possessed a secret formula for concrete that grew stronger over time, a secret that was lost for over 1,000 years. This is a narrative convenience designed to explain why old world structures are still standing, while our modern bridges crumble after 50 years. The truth is more provocative. The cement wasn't a secret mixture. It was a result of the atmospheric conditions of the pre-reset world. The high-frequency environment allowed for a different type of molecular bonding. The stones were grown, not poured. This is why the joints between blocks in the Great Pyramid or the walls of Sacsayhuaman are so tight that a razor blade cannot fit between them. They weren't carved with copper chisels. They were moulded in a state of acoustic liquefaction. We cannot replicate it today because we no longer have the etheric tools required to manipulate the frequency of matter. We are builders of sand, living in the shadows of the masters of stone. If you examine the star charts of the 16th century and compare them to the sky we see today, there is a discrepancy that no amount of stellar drift can explain. The constellations have shifted in a way that suggests a physical tilt of the Earth's axis, the very event that triggered the mud floods. The North Star was not always Polaris. The orientation of the great cathedrals and the star forts was originally aligned with Ea's different celestial pole. When the Earth tilted, the energy grid failed. The spires could no longer catch the atmospheric charge because they were no longer in resonance with the stars. This is why the occult traditions of the elite are so obsessed with astronomy. They aren't worshipping planets, they are tracking the realignment of the grid. They are waiting for the moment when the Earth returns to its original position and the power of the old world comes roaring back to life. They fear that day as much as they anticipate it, for it will be the end of their wired monopoly. The ghost cities of China and the empty planned communities of the modern era are not failures of capitalism. They are preparations. The elite know that the reset cycle is accelerating. They are building the husks of the next foundling civilization, just as the pioneers discovered San Francisco and New York. The survivors of the next event will be funneled into these empty, ready-made cities. They will be told they are the chosen ones, the builders of a new utopia, and they will never know that the streets they walk on were built by a civilization they were taught to forget. This is the pattern of the erasure. It is a loop of harvesting and replanting. The institutional gatekeepers are not just our leaders, they are the gardeners of the human crop. They prune the branches of our history to keep us from growing too high, ensuring that we never reach the light of the original sun. There is a technical term used in the old architectural manuals, entasis. It refers to the slight curve in the columns of Greek and Roman temples. The official explanation is that it is an optical correction to make the columns look straight to the human eye. What if it was functional? What if those columns were resonators and the entasis was the specific curvature required to amplify a specific frequency? Every detail of the old world's architecture, from the fluting of the pillars to the gilding of the domes, was a technical specification. The Gilded Age was not about wealth, it was about conductivity. Gold is one of the most conductive elements on the periodic table. By covering the domes of the world in gold leaf, the Tartarians were maximizing the efficiency of their energy collectors. When the victors took over, they scraped the gold off and called it loot. They stole the copper and called it scrap. They took the heart of the machine and left us with the decoration. The asylums of the late 19th century were massive, castle-like structures, often built on the outskirts of cities with no clear source of funding. Thousands of them were constructed simultaneously across the globe. Why? Not to treat the mentally ill. They were processing centres for the refuseniks, those survivors of the Great Reset who refused to accept the new history. If you remembered the towers working, you were insane. If you remembered your parents before they were immigrants, you were delusional. The asylums were where the memory of Tartaria was lobotomized. The electroshock therapy used in these institutions was a cruel parody of the old world's energy healing. They took the frequency that once cured the body and used it to break the mind. They cleared the mental landscape so they could plant the seeds of the industrial narrative. Ask yourself why these buildings are now being converted into luxury condos. The trauma is still in the walls. The Statue of Liberty is often cited as a gift from France to the United States. But look at the crown, look at the torch. It is the exact iconography of the Colossus of Rhodes, a known Tartarian energy beacon. The statue wasn't a gift. It was a reclaimed artifact. It was found in pieces in the ruins of the old world and reassembled as a symbol of the new regime's liberty, a liberty that only exists within the confines of their grid. The torch doesn't represent enlightenment in the philosophical sense. It represents the light of the ether. It is a taunt. They put the technology of our ancestors on a pedestal and told us it was a poem. They turned a functioning antenna into a tourist attraction, and we stand at its feet, taking pictures, never realizing that we are looking at the very thing that could set us free. In the year 1851, the Crystal Palace was built in London to house the Great Exhibition. It was a structure of glass and iron so vast it could contain full-grown elm trees. We are told it was designed by a gardener, Joseph Paxton, and built in just 9 months. It is an engineering miracle that we couldn't replicate today with modern cranes and logistics. The truth is that the Crystal Palace was not built for the exhibition. It was a pre-existing hot house of the Tartarian era, a massive atmospheric energy farm that utilized glass to trap the charge of the sun. The exhibition was just a way to fill the space before the building was destroyed by fire. They showed the public the wonders of the old world one last time. Then they smashed the glass. They couldn't let us see how easy life was when the energy was free and the climate was controlled. The maps of the Underground Railroad share a curious overlap with the maps of the pre-reset tunnel systems. The railroad wasn't just a metaphorical path to freedom, it was a literal use of the buried infrastructure. The conductors were those who still knew the old routes, the paths that ran through the catacombs and the abandoned Tartarian subways. This is why the movement was so successful and so difficult for the authorities to track. They weren't hiding in woods, they were moving beneath the feet of their oppressors. The freedom they were seeking was not just the end of slavery, but a return to the sovereign lands that hadn't yet been fully integrated into the new grid. But the victors caught up. They mapped the tunnels, sealed the entrances, and turned the story of the underground into a moral fable, stripping it of its technical reality. We are living in the silent era. We have the artifacts, we have the ruins, and we have the feeling in our bones that something is missing. The day Tartaria went silent was the day we were taught to stop listening to the earth. The unresolved philosophical open loop is this: if the truth is buried under 5 feet of mud and 100 years of lies, is it still the truth? Or has the lie become our reality? We are the children of the reset, playing with the broken toys of our ancestors. But the mud is shifting. The next event is approaching. And this time, we might not be so easy to erase. The silence is not an end. It is a breath held between notes. Ask yourself, what happens when the music starts again? Will you recognize the tune, or will you be the next orphan in the train? The erasure of our collective memory was not merely a conquest of land, but a conquest of the sky itself. In the mid-19th century, a phenomenon occurred that has been meticulously omitted from our official astronomical records: the Great Atmospheric Drowning. It was the moment the ether, the fluid, energetic medium that the Tartarians tapped for their wireless power, was intentionally destabilized. We are told that the blue of our sky is a simple result of Rayleigh scattering. What if that blue is actually the colour of a pressurized cage? The Tartarian accounts, found in the margins of suppressed journals, speak of a sky that was once a pale, shimmering violet, a hue that allowed for a higher spectrum of light to reach the surface. This was the Violet Age, a time of hyperfertility and cognitive clarity. The event that brought the mud also brought the blue shift, a chemical and frequency-based thickening of the atmosphere that dimmed our sun and slowed our cellular repair. Ask yourself why the chemtrail phenomenon of the modern era is so focused on creating a metallic haze. It is a maintenance program. They are maintaining the blue cage, ensuring that the atmospheric charge remains grounded and that the resonant frequency of the human heart never realigns with the ionosphere. The institutional gatekeepers know that if the atmosphere ever clears to its original state, the free energy towers will start to hum of their own accord. The stone will remember. The copper will draw, not a cloud, not a vapour. Something else. A chemical veil pulled over the eyes of a species to keep them from seeing the gears of their own prison. The Great Smog was the first prototype of this atmospheric management, a way to use the industrial output of the new elite to reinforce the boundaries of our isolation. Consider the lighthouse networks that dot the coastlines of the world. In the pre-reset era, these were not warnings for ships. They were the maritime nodes of the global grid, pulling energy from the salt water and the air to create a navigational light that required no fuel. When the grid was shattered, the victors couldn't let these beacons stand as proof of a superior science. They stripped the mercury lenses. The Fresnel lenses, they claim, were invented in 1822 and replaced them with kerosene lamps. They turned a planetary guidance system into a series of lonely, flickering candles. We look at the lighthouse and see a romantic symbol isolation. We should see a lobotomized titan, a reminder of a time when the world was illuminated by the very air we breathe. The The silence of Tartaria is the silence of the sky, a vast blue amnesia that we have mistaken for home.